Okay, everybody. Now I will try to give you a brief explanation of the rest of this chapter, dealing with expectations, the role of expectations in macroeconomic theory. So the last thing that we touched on in the previous lecture was this difference between adaptive expectations on the one hand and rational expectations on the other hand. These are two different kinds and two different views of how people form expectations and how these expectations affect economic outcomes. Adaptive expectations mean that the way people act as economic agents is that they extrapolate from the past. They look at what was going on with regard to the prices. In the past, we are talking about expectations of future prices and how people adapt, how people adjust their decisions, how much to work and at which wages, depending on the price level, expected or projected price level in the future. So adaptive expectations mean that people look at the past, they see what was the inflation rate in the previous year or a previous month, previous period of time, and they make their decisions about what to do in the future by extrapolating the inflation price level change trends from the past. So if the inflation rate was 2% last year, people will tend to work 2% less, or they will ask for 2% higher wages in the future to compensate them for the loss, for the higher prices that they will have to pay for consumer goods with their money. So that's adaptive expectations. People do not form any kind of active guesses about what's going to happen in the future. They don't have independent basis for forming an expectation about the future aside from what have happened in the past already. So that's Milton Friedman's type of theory that we discussed last time and its relationship to the Phillips curve. The second approach that is also very influential is rational expectations. It says that people try to anticipate what inflation rate is going to be. So they don't just blindly and passively and adaptively look at the past and try to extrapolate. They try to make active and accurate guesses on the basis of a variety of different criteria about what's going to happen this time around. And there are some remarkable differences in what happens at the level of a macroeconomy if the way how expectations are formed is rational in this sense. So rational expectations are proactive. They are not just reactive and adaptive, they are proactive. If they're correct, then the macroeconomic policy will be far less efficient, as we will see later on. So the basis for the for monetary and fiscal policy that you see in this exhibit 5 is that you can count that these adaptive changes will be slow. So what's going to happen in the Friedman's theory, I'm just reminding you of this thing that we already discussed. As inflation rate increases, people look at the past. The inflation rate was lower in the past. Obviously, that's the inflation level 1. The price level 1. People then project or assume that the price level will be, or the increase in the price level will be the same as in the past. That means that they're going to work more than before, or that they're going to work the same amount of time, the same number of hours as before, which will result in a higher price level. This aggregate demand curve will shift to the right, and we have a higher real GDP, higher production, and higher rate of inflation. But in the process, people will learn that they are being swindled, that the inflation has increased, that the real value of their nominal income has decreased, because they're earning the same amount of the same money as before. Their wages are the same as before, and they work the same number of hours as before, but the purchasing power of their wages is lower. So now they're gonna either reduce labor hours, or they're gonna seek higher wages, and this will lead to a gradual shift in the supply curve. If people work less, and or if they ask for higher wages, that will lead on two different accounts to a reduction in productivity of the economy. People work less, less is being produced. People ask for higher wages, the unemployment will increase, people will work less. The total production of the economy will be lower. So then the aggregate supply curve gradually shifts back, and you end up in the same equilibrium with the same amount of production and higher prices. So that's adaptive expectations. So they lead to re-equilibrating of the economy in a slow process, two-step process. Actually, you first have to go into this inflationary disequilibrium, that you produce too much and too high a price, and then the economy adapts to that by reducing productivity. So that's Friedmanite adaptive expectations. Rational expectation says that people will anticipate this thing here, that the inflation is gonna increase from 1 to 2. They will anticipate in advance. So they're not going to work the same number of labor hours. They're going to reduce labor hours, and they're going to ask for higher wages right away at point 1. Here they ask for higher wages when the economy is already at point 2. In rational expectation, they're gonna predict, they're gonna expect this thing to happen, and they're gonna try and forestall it by working less or by asking for higher wages right away. So what's gonna happen? These two processes will be simultaneous: this increase in the aggregate demand and decrease in the aggregate supply. So even in the short run, if inflation rate is correctly predicted, even in the short run, you're going to move from point 1 to point 3 by and large directly. The economy is never going to be in this position number 2. This shift of the aggregate demand curve will coincide in time with the shift of the aggregate supply curve to the left, because people anticipating higher prices will work less and ask higher wages from the get-go, from the very beginning. And then even if you print more money and stimulate the economy, what you get on the demand side, what you gain on the demand side, you're going to be losing in the same time on the supply side. So that's the crux of the argument of rational expectations, that this very quick change, very quick adjustment time in the economy leads to the situation in which monetary and fiscal policy could not be efficient. Of course, this is based on the idea that prices and wages are very flexible. That means that they can change very quickly here at this point 1. When you start increasing aggregate demand, the assumption is that prices and wages can be adjusted, that people can negotiate for higher wages very quickly, and that they're going to start working lower hours very quickly. So then the aggregate supply curve can move very quickly. The consequences of people's decisions to reduce production could be seen very quickly. Higher wages increase very quickly, labor costs increase very quickly, production decreases very quickly. So that's one crucial assumption of this entire analysis. Okay, now one of the concepts that we need to learn in order to see in detail how this works is a real wage. So real wage is an inflation-adjusted wage. So that's the purchasing power of nominal income. That's how much stuff you can buy for the same nominal amount of money. So real wage is a nominal wage. That's the dollar value over price level times 100. So then if price level is, remember, CPI, consumer price index, if consumer price index is 100, then your nominal wage coincides to real wage. So you're always comparing 2 years. the initial years, or the so-called reference period, is always set at 100. CPI, Consumer Price Index, is always 100 in an initial year. And then you look what happens in a period 2. So if CPI in that period 2, this price level refers to that price level at a later period. If it's higher than 100, then your real wage will be lower than your nominal wage, obviously. If you divide the same number by 103 and multiply it by 100, you're going to get less than that number. And vice versa, if you have deflation, which means that the consumer price index will be lower than 100, negative inflation rate, then your real wage will be higher than your nominal wage. Okay, just should be obvious, but this is just a useful definition that will help us now to understand what's going to happen, how this thing that I've shown you before, how this thing here happens. So this is a movement of the short-run aggregate supply curve, that it varies. Higher the expected future price level, greater the shift of the aggregate supply curve it is to the left. So you see this price level here, expected price level is 120, so 20%. So this is how much the curve shifts. Then higher expected increase in price level, reduction of aggregate supply will be greater, and so on, here even greater. Higher expected increase, 70% inflation, 70% or thereabouts reduction in real productivity. All of that is based on the idea that people can rationally predict or expect future inflation and adjust their behavior right now in accordance with these expectations. So then if people expect the price to fall, consumer price index to fall, this price level here expect to fall, so what's going to happen? All other things being equal, real wage will increase. So if price level falls, real wage will increase. That means that people will tend to work more. Wages are better or higher, people will work more, or at least more work will be done. That doesn't mean necessarily that every single individual will work more. It doesn't have to be the case, but more work will be done. More labor will be done, more production, more output will be created. Aggregate supply curve, this curve here, will shift. So you see from 150 to 120, if the consumer price index falls, the aggregate volume of output will increase, and vice versa. If prices are expected to increase, then that means that people expect real wages to fall. Here, real wage, nominal wage over the price level, which is higher than 100, then that means the real wage will go down. So an increase in price level means an expectation of a higher price level in the future than it is now. Means an expectation of lower real wage. If the lower real wage are expected, that means that less work will be done. Less work will be done. That means then that less output will be produced. If people work less output is produced. That means that the short-run aggregate supply curve will move to the left. So from any one of these curves, you see when inflation increases, aggregate supply curve moves to the left. So see now the key component of the analysis here is the difference. What is the ratio? What is the difference between the expected price level, the price level that people anticipate at present, and the actual price level that is going to materialize in the future? So there are three possibilities actually here, and all three have different consequences that we're going to analyze in a moment. They could be equal. That's the baseline scenario, baseline case here, that according to the school of rational expectations is much more likely than to happen than the other two. That means that people by and large correctly anticipate the future price level. So then expected price level equals actual price level that is going to happen. So this, from the left-hand side of the equality sign, it's the present anticipation. This is what's actually going to happen in a while. But also it's possible that people's expectations are too pessimistic or too high. That people expect the price level, the inflation rate to be 7%, and it turns out after 6 months that is 5%. So then expected value of price level change is higher than the actualized price level change or inflation rate. Or it could be the other way around, that people may expect 2% increase, and what happens is 5 or 4 or 6% increase. So these three scenarios, I'm just emphasizing here that according to rational expectation school, the first scenario is by far the most likely. That's what makes this theory powerful, because they argue that this is the default case. This is the default scenario. These other two are less likely to happen in any given situation. But let's see what are the consequences of every one of them. So the case one, anticipated rate equals actualized rate of inflation. That's actually correct anticipation of policy. People correctly anticipate the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve System, of the central bank. The case two is actually the first case of incorrect anticipation. That means the upward bias. That means that you overestimate the future price increase. And you have another case, or the other case of incorrect anticipation of policy, which is downward bias, which means that you underestimate the increase in price level. And there is a fourth case, which essentially boils down to the monetarist case, that the absence of any anticipation. The people don't have any active anticipation what's going to happen in the future based on any independent sources of data or information, that they just extrapolate. What happened before, the same thing is going to happen in the future. So this is by far least theoretically interesting, because that eventually boils down to this case here, monetarist adaptive expectations. So these people here, they do not anticipate at all. They just adapt to what happens in the future. Okay, so let's now take a look at what happens in every one of these situations. Now, first, the default case. The first default case is that people correctly anticipate the consequences of what the central bank is going to do. This will lead directly to the conclusion that monetary policy is inefficient. So people correctly anticipate what's going to happen in terms of future increase in prices, and they accordingly form their correct predictions and anticipations about the future, and they then change wages and prices, which are flexible in such a way as to take into account proactively the effects of monetary and fiscal policies. So then monetary and fiscal policies cannot achieve their goals. They cannot boost aggregate demand. They cannot increase production, because people will take into account this, and they will adjust their wages and prices in such a way as to undermine the effectiveness of the policy. How this works? Here is the picture here. How this works? So you have aggregate supply, aggregate demand curves. You have initial equilibrium here. Our well-known picture, price level on vertical axis, real GDP on the horizontal axis. This is the short-term, the long-term aggregate supply curve. Pardon me. This is the initial equilibrium. Short-run curve intersects the long-run curve, and aggregate demand, the initial aggregate demand curve. That's point 1. Price level is 100, and Q1 is the amount of output. Now let's assume that the government wants to increase by 10% the price level. That's their idea about what they want to do. So what they want to do is to increase the price level by 10%, which would mean a shift in the aggregate demand curve to the right, to this yellow curve here, and they want to get the economy at a point which is not here at all marked, which is the intersection of this initial aggregate supply curve at a lower price level, and a new enhanced aggregate demand curve here. So this point, intersection of the gray curve and the yellow curve. But now remember what we know from before, what happens here when the price level is about to increase and people correctly anticipate this future increase in the price level, they reduce the amount of work that they do. Production decreases downward, aggregate supply curve, production decreases and aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. In the same time, this is the key assumption. In the same time, while the aggregate demand curve moves to the right, demand increases, supply is shrinking. Because people know and they correctly anticipate what's going to happen, that their income is going to get devalued by a higher price level, so they either reduce the labor hours or they increase their wages, negotiate for higher wages. Wages are flexible, which means they can change very quickly. If nominal wages increase, that means that the employer's labor costs will increase. That means that the production productivity will go down. So less work will be done, less output will be produced. So these two processes working in the same time will result eventually that when you reach the point when the price level increases 10%, your productivity of the economy will increase by an equal amount, and your new equilibrium point, this is important, the short-run equilibrium point. The short-run equilibrium will be in point 2. So nothing happens. The difference between the monetarist adaptive expectations and this thing here is that here, even in the short run, you cannot do anything. In a monetarist view, you can fool the people for a brief while. You can convince them to move to this point on the curve here. And they're going to work a little bit more for a while. More goods and services will be produced at higher prices. But once the entire swindle is discovered, once they start learning the hard way that their slightly higher income that the same nominal income that they have is actually devalued by higher prices, they're going to start seeking higher wages and they'll start adjusting and reducing the amount of output produced, and you're going to end up eventually in the long run on the same curve here. The difference is that in the rational expectation version of the story, this happens very quickly. This happens in the short run. So there is no difference whatsoever between short run and long run adjustments in the economy, because people correctly anticipate and they know what's going to happen. They proactively undermine government policies even in the short run by seeking higher wages at point 1 rather than at this intermediate point here. So hopefully this is clear. This is the key difference. This is the key difference between the monetarist view of the short-term macroeconomic equilibrium and the role of expectations in it, and the rational expectation school, or sometimes called the new classical theory, on the other hand, which is based on rational expectations, of course. Now, so what's going to happen if you have a situation whereby people overestimate what happens? So that's theoretically possible. The next two cases are possible. It's Exhibit 8 and Exhibit 9 are possible. They're far less likely to happen in practical terms, but theoretically they can happen. It's interesting to look at these two scenarios to see what's going to happen and why. So you have the same equilibrium. You start from this point 1, which is macroeconomic equilibrium, and you want to increase the price level by 10%. So that's the goal, the macroeconomic goal that the government, this is the point here that the government wants, intersection of the yellow and the gray curve, that the government wants to have the economy at. Okay. However, for some reason, people incorrectly anticipate the intentions of government, they predict that the price level is going to be 118 instead of 110. So their perceived shift of the aggregate demand curve, they expect the aggregate demand curve to move all the way to this 83 curve, this dark red curve, and they perceive that the new equilibrium will be over here. Okay, so what they do, what we know from this first case, if they correctly anticipate the future equilibrium, they're going to move the aggregate supply curve to the left to intersect with the long run curve here at point 2 and the new aggregate demand curve. However, if they incorrectly predict what's going to happen, they're going to overshoot. They're going to ask for too high wages, or they're going to reduce their production too much. So instead, at the equilibrium here, that is the real equilibrium. That's the real equilibrium at which economy should be, because the government increased the aggregate demand to 82, and the real equilibrium point is here, where the price level is $110. However, because people anticipated falsely or incorrectly that the aggregate demand curve will move all the way to 83, they then reduce their production not to this aggregate supply curve 3, the correct curve here, this point 3, but they go all the way to this leftwardmost short-run aggregate supply curve. So they reduce production too much, and this creates recession. So you can say that if people incorrectly anticipate the future price level by overestimating a price increase, this is going to result in too much of a reduction in the level of output, which will lead to a short-term recession. So short-term recession is shown as this difference between the natural level of production, marked by this green line, and the temporary short-term level of production Q2, here corresponding to point 2. So now what needs to happen for an economy to go back to the equilibrium? Actually, once people realize that they kind of overshoot, the production is gonna increase. This is just the elimination of the recessionary equilibrium. Production will increase the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, because people will see that their real wages are much higher than they thought they would be, so they will increase the amount of work done, and production will be increased until we reach the point 3 here, where the economy is in the equilibrium once again. So the sequence of events, in the case which is less likely, that people incorrectly anticipate the future price change by overestimating it, they will reduce production too much, which will create a recessionary disequilibrium, which will be solved at the end of the story by the production increasing and aggregate supply curve shifting to the right to close the recessionary gap and to bring the economy back into equilibrium. So that's the upward bias when people overestimate the future aggregate demand. What happens when you have the downward bias, when people underestimate the future increase in the aggregate demand? So what's going to happen then is that the real aggregate demand curve, the real aggregate demand shift will be from point 1 to this curve, dark red curve over here. People incorrectly anticipating or underestimating the future increase in the aggregate demand will then shift or reduce their level of economic production insufficiently. So see, they're gonna underestimate the future increase whenever inflationary expectations increase. You by now understand that productivity reacts by decreasing by the same amount. If anticipation is correct, they both move to the same in same percentage in different directions. If you underestimate the future inflation rate, then you're gonna reduce your volume of output insufficiently from this gray curve to the light blue curve here, aggregate supply curve 2. Hoping that you're gonna reach this equilibrium here. That's what you think. Your perceived aggregate demand curve, your expected aggregate demand curve is here, so you reduce your aggregate supply down here and you expect equilibrium to be here, but the equilibrium is not there. Equilibrium is not here. Actually, the real aggregate demand curve shifted more to the right, so the price level increased more than you have expected. Then, so now you are in a situation of an inflationary disequilibrium or inflationary gap that we discussed before. So go and revisit. This is downward bias here equals inflationary gap. Upward bias means recessionary gap. So I'm not going to be repeating now what is inflationary, what is a recessionary gap. Go back and revisit that we discussed that already. So the solution for these two types of situation is just a normal ordinary garden variety elimination or closing the recessionary or inflationary gap. How is inflationary gap solved? By aggregate supply curve shifting to the left. So people realize that they didn't reduce their labor time and labor hours enough, that they haven't asked for high enough nominal wages to compensate them for the loss of higher price level of consumer goods that they had to pay. So they ask now for higher wages. They say, oh, gee, I was not strict enough. I didn't ask for high enough increase in my wages. I expected 10% increase in price level, so I asked only for 10% higher wages. That led to the contraction of output for only 10%. Now, in order to be to get whole economically, I need 5% higher wages still. So that will lead to 5% of additional, or 6%, it doesn't matter, some equilibrium value of reduction of output. So you understand this logic. Nominal wages going up, that means that the labor cost going up, that means that production will have to go down. And then we reach the new equilibrium here, which is higher price level, and you have the same volume of production as in the equilibrium. So that's essentially, these two situations correspond to the imperfect anticipations of what is going to happen with the price level in the future. And here, if the policy is not anticipated at all, then people simply, this is described in the monetarist adaptive expectations case. This is just a repetition of that. So people go from point 1 to point 2 because they don't expect anything. They just accept the nominal wages that they had before. They're already compensated them for any price increases, so they expect the same amount of money for their labor as before. After a while, they realize that they're getting robbed. They ask for higher wages, and they go back. Then by asking for higher wages, production goes down, aggregate supply curve shifts leftward, and they reach the new equilibrium once again. Okay, so this is the rational expectations theory. The main conclusion that rational expectations theory made, and why this theory is and has been always influential, is that it proves or claims that macroeconomic policy cannot be efficient. That by anticipating the intentions and the final goals of policymakers, the economic agents, workers and entrepreneurs are going to adjust their calculations accordingly in order to prevent the government from achieving its goals. So if inflation rates are correctly anticipated, no trade-off between inflation and unemployment will be possible. No trade-off as shown in the vertical aggregate supply curve will be, not vertical, the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve will be possible. You cannot buy more production, higher volume of production with higher prices, even in the short run. Even in the short run, people will adjust very quickly to higher rate of inflation. So macroeconomic policy is bunk. Macroeconomic policy is inefficient, so you shouldn't try to do anything. That's the main conclusion. You cannot fool people into behaving in an irrational fashion that even in the short run, in an irrational fashion that harms them, so that harm them economically. So now there was a reaction to this, reaction to both monetarism and the rational expectation schools, the Keynesian, the so-called new Keynesian theory. So the new Keynesian theory says that you can, in principle, accept the idea of expectations. So they innovate the standard Keynesian theory that didn't have any place for the for any kind of theory of expectations whatsoever. So they now say yes, expectations that people form about the future are relevant for what's going to happen in the future in a macroeconomy. But they disagree with the neoclassical and the rational expectations and school analysis about what it is that is going to happen. So they don't believe that perfect, even if you have a perfect prediction, that's what they say, that's what Keynesians say. Even if you perfectly anticipate the future changes in the price level, this perfect anticipation of future price level will not be translated into an automatic and smooth reduction in the level of productivity in an economy. And the main reason for that is that prices and wages are not flexible. They're sticky or rigid. Sticky means that they're fixed by contracts and by informal rules for a certain period of time. There are a variety of reasons why wages and prices are sticky, and they cannot be changed unilaterally in a very short period of time. And if that's the case, and everything hinges on that, if that's the case, then you will not have a perfect kind of adjustment as here. Let me show. So this canonical, not normal case, standard case of the new classical theory, that you move from point one to point two very quietly, silently, and quickly, without much fuss, without much friction. Government is increasing the money supply, people are reducing supply of labor and volume of production. And you end up on the same curve with a higher price level. So that's the key assumption for this to happen, is that the prices and wages adjust quickly. So this means that this curve will shift from point one to point two, from this yellow curve to blue curve, only if workers can renegotiate their wage contracts very quickly and costlessly with employers, exact higher wages in 1 week or 1 month, and change the labor costs very quickly. This will work only if prices and wages are flexible, easily changed. Now, New Keynesian said, no, that's not how it works in the real world. So according to them, even if you assume that the perfect prediction about the future price level exists, you will not have a sufficient reduction in the aggregate supply to match the increase in the aggregate demand that government enacts. So here you see the yellow initial aggregate demand curve and initial equilibrium point 1, and you have the aggregate demand curve 2, this dark red curve. This is actual and perceived shift, which means that the expectations are perfectly correct. People were not deceived, as in these freak cases here, many complicated things are happening because people either overestimate or underestimate the future price increases. Here, people perfectly perceive, people perfectly predict what's going to happen in the future. So the realized price level corresponds to the expected price level, and the increased aggregate demand, expected aggregate demand, will correspond to the actually materializing aggregate demand. But the key problem is with the aggregate supply here. In order for the new classical theory to work and for rational expectations to play a role the new classical theory wants it to play, you will have to move from this aggregate supply curve to this supply curve down here. So this point 2, a new equilibrium on the vertical supply curve over here. So production doesn't increase at all in the short term. The increase in the aggregate demand is exactly matched by a decrease in the volume of production or in the position of the supply curve. So that's what should have happened in the new classical or the rational expectations theory. What happens in reality, according to Keynesians, is that it's not so easy to renegotiate wages and wage contracts. So the increase in prices, so workers want higher prices, higher nominal incomes to compensate them for their correctly perceived losses from higher price level in the future. So they know that this is going to be the price level in the short run over here. So they want to increase their wages by as much. And if they succeed in increasing their wages sufficiently to compensate them for an increased price level, for an increased prices of consumer goods, then the aggregate supply curve will shift from point 1 to point 2. So this leftward supply curve. But this is not going to happen. They will be hindered in their ambition to increase their wages so much because of the rigidity or stickiness of the wages. They will succeed in increasing it a little bit, but not enough. So the macroeconomic equilibrium, according to the new Keynesians, will be here. So the old Keynesians would expect the equilibrium, the old Keynesians would expect the new equilibrium to be here. But new Keynesians agree, yeah, there is something to these expectations theory, but it will not be enough. This reduction in aggregate supply will not be enough to match the volume of increase in aggregate demand. So this 2' point will be new short-term macroeconomic equilibrium. And the conclusion is a much more optimistic one for the Keynesians. That means that you still can influence the aggregate demand, you still can move the long-run aggregate supply curve by stimulating the economy through the aggregate demand, because insufficient flexibility in prices and wages will prevent workers to quickly renegotiate their wage rates upwards to increase their nominal wages and reduce the aggregate supply enough to match the initial increase in the aggregate demand. So instead of 10%, the wages will increase 5% because not everybody will be able to renegotiate wages because they are fixed in the long run. That's a very common thing that happens. You sign a wage contract and it says in next year or next 2 years, your wage will not change at all. So then the corresponding reduction in the volume of output will be less than if the wages are perfectly adjusted to an increased price level. So then the conclusion is, according to the new Keynesian theory, it's not so optimistic as before. The possibility to stimulate the economy with higher aggregate demand is not 100%, but it's maybe 30, 40, 50%. you can do something. Macroeconomic policy is not completely powerless and factless as in the new classical theory based on rational expectation. So the key difference between the new Keynesians and the new classicals is that the new Keynesians believe in rational expectations. They completely agree with that people correctly perceive the future price level, which is shown in this aggregate demand curve too, that actual and perceived shift in aggregate demand are equal. So the future price level is correctly anticipated, but where they disagree is that how quickly the structure of wage rates can adjust to this correctly perceived increase in inflation. And they say it cannot quickly adjust. So the labor costs cannot increase in sync with an increase in aggregate demand simultaneously, so to prevent an increase in the production as a consequence of inflation. Okay, so that's the new Keynesianism. So they sought to reconcile the old Keynesian idea that is kind of simple-minded and crude. It says just increase aggregate demand and you're okay. You're gonna move this long run aggregate supply curve to the left. Once you, who cares about the long run? The short run is what is important. You move aggregate demand, you stimulate the economy. And then this criticism that rational expectations might prevent this from happening made them aware or made it necessary for them to tweak, to adjust their theory by saying, okay, even if this is the case, we still could do some useful things by using the monetary and fiscal policy of the government. Okay, that's that. Just one more thing that I wanted, in a very abbreviated fashion, to say. That's the so-called real business cycle theory. So what is the real business cycle theory? That's a macroeconomic theory that says that macroeconomic disequilibria, these situations in which supply and demand are out of sync, that the short-run supply curve is out of sync with long-run supply curve, this either inflationary or recessionary disequilibria. These types of situations that monetarists and Keynesians and new classicals analyze. They say these things could happen not only because of the deficiency of aggregate demand, anything having to do with demand, but also because of something weird, something unpredictable happening to the long-run aggregate supply curve. The economy could be out of sync, out of equilibrium in the short run, also because something happens to the basic structure of the economy, the basic structure of the supply of the economy and its productive capacity, as it's shown here. So the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, and you have a new macroeconomic equilibrium because, for example, natural disaster happened. So now we're in one, or the Middle Eastern countries block the supply of oil to Western world. So that's the reason why some recessions happened in 1970s, because oil is so important as a source of energy to Western society, so disproportionately used compared to other sources, that this shutdown of the importation of oil led to a decline in production of everything else. Now we don't have the oil shock, but we have a shock of this crazy quarantine that the politicians simply shut down the whole economy for an indefinite period of time, and everybody is simply forbidden from working. So this is what's happening now. We're moving from long run aggregate supply curve 1. That's the quantity of output that we can produce if we work normally. Everybody goes to work and everybody produces whatever they produce. Now people are simply prohibited from doing so. People are forced to stay home, and the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. So the real business cycle theory argues that sometimes a disequilibrium could be caused not by anything happening with the short-run demand and supply, but rather something might be wrong with the basic structure of the economy, with the basic productive capabilities of economy to work 100%, uh, to work 100% of its capacity. Okay, so that's the last thing that I've got for you this evening. Thank you for your attention. Please don't hesitate. Thus far, I haven't gotten any questions from your side. So please don't hesitate to post your questions in the discussion section. If not, maybe next week I may schedule one kind of discussion group on Canvas that I will connect with all of you, and it will give you a chance to to chat with me and to ask questions and make comments about the material from this chapter, and also about any current economic news and topics that you might be interested in thus far, whatever is going on with our economy, whether we are gonna end up in a recession or not, and why and how, and the economic consequences of this regime of quarantines that is ongoing right now, and so on. Okay, so good night, everybody, and I'll see you soon.